Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session on hardening your moving environment, accelerating detection and remediation to build cyber resiliency. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started today. This webinar is going to be recorded and will be sent out to all the participants afterwards. All attendees will be muted at the beginning of the session. We invite you to ask questions, but please use the Q&A box on the bottom right hand of your screen and not the chat box. The chat box is a bit harder to follow Q&A. So if you put all your Q&A in the Q&A box, we'll be sure to ask the companies the questions at the end of the event. And if you have any questions about the presentation, ServiceNow or NewRocket, please contact Kirk Hogan, who is our NewRocket contact for this event, and his contact information is on the screen, or I can provide it after the event. At this point in time, I'd like to pass the presentation over to the U.S. Embassy's Deputy Senior Commercial Officer, John Fleming, for welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon and welcome virtually to today's information session. As Tracy mentioned, my name is John Fleming, and I'm the U.S. Department of Commerce's Deputy Senior Commercial Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. The bilateral relationship between the United States and Canada is one of the world's closest and most extensive. This is reflected in the high volume of trade and investment, as well as the way our two countries work closely together on multiple levels: politically, culturally, militarily, and economically. In February of last year, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau launched a roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership that provides a platform for increasing trade and investment, combating climate change, recovering from the pandemic, and tackling other priority global issues together. The U.S. Department of Commerce's U.S. Commercial Service in Canada is supporting these lofty goals by assisting U.S. companies to build and strengthen relationships with Canadian government officials and business partners. One of the ways in which we foster these trade relationships is by developing programs, such as this one, to introduce Canadians to unique U.S. strategies and solutions that can enhance and support global IT security. Today's event was organized by Tracy. Tracy Ford is our commercial specialist and the Commerce Department lead for IT in Canada. If you have any questions or wish to speak to someone about sourcing U.S. products or solutions, please connect with Tracy. Now, with those general comments, let's turn the focus now on today's program. Vulnerabilities no longer exist only in your data center. They are on the move within all your mobile devices, creating endless opportunities for digital attack. So how do you secure your moving targets and ultimately build a trusted relationship between your IT and SecOps teams that will create future operational resiliency? In today's session, we'll hear from ServiceNow and NewRocket about how to harden your moving environment by accelerating detection and remediation to build cyber resiliency. ServiceNow delivers digital workflows that create great experiences and unlock productivity. The Now platform provides a smarter way to workflow across industries, and ServiceNow is leading the way to a new era of employee and customer experiences. NewRocket delivers meaningful experiences and extraordinary results with ServiceNow. They are the ecosystem leaders in customer and field service implementations, risk and resilience, human experience design, and one of only 2 companies worldwide to be awarded all 4 ServiceNow workflow badges, an elite achievement that recognizes certifications across the entire ServiceNow platform. We have an exciting and talented group of panelists today representing both companies. I would like to introduce Klaudius Malinowski, who is a security solutions specialist at ServiceNow and brings 20 years of experience in various technologies across integrated risk management, cybersecurity solutions, and robotic automation. He spent several years working with the Canadian federal and provincial governments, as well as various other Canadian organizations, supporting their strategic and tactical transformation initiatives across security operations. Klaudius, I invite you to take main stage and start today's event. Thank you very much.
And thank you, John, for the very warm welcome. And I'd first like to just take a moment and thank the U.S. Department of Commerce and the U.S. Commercial Service in Canada for hosting us today. It's an absolute honor that we get to spend the next hour with you folks to dive into a really top of mind discussion around hardening your moving environment. Now, John, you've already done a great job of introducing me. I'm the National Security Solutions Lead at ServiceNow Canada. But before we jump into the content, I'd just like to give an opportunity for my co-hosts to introduce themselves as well. So first, over to you, Dale.
Thanks very much, Claudius, and thank you, John, for the great introduction. Really excited to be here with all of you for the next 50 minutes or so. I am the Global IT Asset Management Practice Leader at NewRocket, and I'm very eager to help make connections between hardening your moving environment and being able to answer three very basic questions about your IT asset management estate. And that is, what assets do you have? Where are they located? And who's using them? Because that in and of itself will accelerate detection and really support your cybersecurity objectives. And I will now pass it on to Kirk.
Thanks, Dale. Kirk Hogan. I run the global technology area for NewRocket, covering off the ServiceNow platform. My experiences for the last 25 years have been mostly in the systems design and implementation, both tactical and strategic. Most recently, for the last say 15 to 17, is around building up SOCs and NOCs and anything to do with security technology. I'm actually obsessed with how it all plugs together and fits. So the last 5 to 7 years I've been spending in innovation, trying to find new ways to push the boundaries. So I'm excited about today's talk because it all matters. There's not one thing in particular. So I think what we, the title of the event is actually trying to deliver three messages in one. I think about the moving environment underpins what's really happened to all of us for the last 2 years. It was happening before the pandemic, but no kidding, everybody went home and all of the assets with them. All of this provided a real challenge, and people scrambled and did yeoman's work about trying to maintain sort of an understanding about what went where and who's using what. What we want to talk about today, I think, is having a more of a purposeful approach, that if we could go back and redesign that, what would we have done differently? The hardening part is really about, I think, doing the responsible things in the right order. Because we talk about hardening that environment. I think what we're really saying is, do we believe that we can continue to deliver trusted products and services, whether they be nonprofit, governmental, private, to the people that consume those, so that we can get their trust and maintain their trust? And I think that the other panelists maybe have a different view on the same challenge, but we have a different perspective on this.
For sure. I'll jump in. And in terms of IT asset management, really your IT asset estate is really beginning to evolve over the past number of years. And as Kirk mentioned, especially when COVID hit and your IT asset estate became distributed and remote, we really started to see that that realm of responsibility expand. And now we're talking more and more not only about the traditional asset classes that are being managed through IT asset management programs, things like your hardware, be that physical or virtual, your software, your network gear, your mobile devices, but we're starting to talk more and more about the Internet of Things. We're dealing with bring your own devices. And one of the messages that, one of the asset categories that is really starting to take center stage is operational technology devices. And these are things like the hardware and software that traditionally controlled contained machines, so equipment, printing presses, and the like. What has happened over the past number of years is that operational technology is now becoming networked. So if everybody thinks about those great smart TVs that we have and the network connected thermostats and even your appliances at home, these are services that have been added onto networks where they used to be very contained. They've now joined your traditional IT asset estate and have access to your network. And so that foundational data that you have been tracking as part of your IT asset estate is now including these other pieces of hardware and software. And with that expansion, your attack surface, your vulnerabilities are also expanding. And I'm not sure, Klaudius, if you have any perspective that you'd like to add to this.
Yeah, I mean, it all starts with, we've heard this before, you can't protect what you can't see, right? So that visibility theme across your entire digital infrastructure is critical, right? But equally important, not only identifying your asset information, but understanding what type of data and information, really what sort of business criticality does this asset have in my environment, so that, of course, that we can make the appropriate risk-based decisions around those assets as well, right? In order for us to be able to trust our data, right, we need to understand how do we keep that data healthy and trustworthy? How do we populate the data, for example, in the CMDB here, in a way that makes the most sense. And really, we start to think about themes like automation, right? Bringing that in an automated way allows us to ensure we've got relevant and refreshed data that's context aware, right? I wanted to kind of share some of those insights. But Kirk, any other thoughts or inputs on that? Oh, I think you are
I'm
muted.
sorry.
There
Yeah. One last thing, and that is around visibility. We think that we've got a good view about what we have, and I think most organizations do. What happens though, right, in a mobile or a dynamic environment is things join and exit the environment all the time. So it's important that visibility flexes with what is coming and going, because you may understand that new things are coming onto your environment, but what about the things that you're not expecting that look like the things that you're expecting? So I think the fidelity of what your information is around that estate. And we did introduce the term attack surface on purpose. And I just want to draw specific attention to that, because I think a lot of organizations talk about what does the business need in order to deliver those products and services. Well, technology supports processes. But if we don't understand necessarily where those things are in their life cycle, we don't know how to connect them back. We don't understand their priority. We don't understand their importance. So it isn't just about the IT estate. It's about its role within our delivery.
Yeah, I want to add one more comment here. You know, the title of this talk track or this discussion, hardening your moving environment. That moving environment piece, I think, is so important, right? Because when you think about some of the statistics that are out there, depending on which study you read, I was seeing things like, on average, employees have 3.2 devices, right? And on average, we see about 17% of those employees having movement in change of role, right? When you start thinking about movers, joiners, leavers, some sort of change to that employee's privileges and rights and access, it's ever changing. It's constant. It's moving, right? Things are always shuffling around. So kind of keeping up with that life cycle, the asset life cycle, it's really, you got to look at things like automation. It could be a tall order as you start looking across all of these honeycombs and all of the different components too. Visibility and asset information. Okay. And Dale, any other thoughts before we kind of move on to some of the next statistics and things?
I don't think so. I think we can move on to the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I wanted to share some insights on what we're seeing, as we start looking at the digital attack surface expanding, right? You heard Dale talk about in a previous slide, all of these convergence of, IT, OT, IoT, all of these assets are growing, right? So this digital attack surface is expanding. And when you look at some of the information here on this screen, things like digital transformation were already in motion, right? But McKinsey did a study not long ago that said that the pandemic had actually accelerated that digital transformation process by 7 years. So what that meant is a lot of businesses were suddenly forced to adapt to this transformation at somewhat of an unnatural pace, right? What that also meant is they are often moving workloads, services, and infrastructure to the cloud, right? To kind of help with easing some of that, that capacity and the growth that's needed really in these scenarios. And then you look across that center statistics. So you look at suddenly a ton of employees are working from home, they're working remotely. That also created new hurdles that we were dealing with. So security teams are suddenly trying to protect things that they cannot control, like employees' home networks, right? That, of course, poses a tremendous visibility challenge to security leaders to keep a track of things like, assets in those environments. And then on the right-hand side in purple here, you can see, many businesses were also increasing their connection to third parties. That could be your vendors, that could be your customers. But of course, that's going to give you some benefits, things like ease of access to sharing information, which is great. But that also means we're introducing additional risks and exposures that way as well to your sensitive data. Now, interestingly enough, Forrester conducted a study that showed that 51% of respondents said that their organizations were not actually assessing the security and privacy practices of all third parties before granting them access to the sensitive and confidential information, right? So that introduces potential risks and exposures. So then at the bottom here, you see, our teams on the security side, they have a daunting task ahead of them. They're looking for where are those exposures, those vulnerabilities across a bunch of different, flavors of vulnerabilities, right? You've got your IT infrastructure, which could be in the cloud, it could be on premise, it could be a hybrid environment. Then you've got vulnerabilities in a sense of misconfigurations, right? Those are exposures. We don't want to be leaving things like default username and passwords or ports opened and things like that. Those are access points for threat actors to, of course, take advantage of. So we're looking for misconfigurations or configuration compliance. Then we're talking about application vulnerabilities. These could be commercially off-the-shelf available applications, or they could be your in-house developed applications. So now we're starting to look at vulnerabilities in applications, things like static or dynamic security application testing vulnerabilities, and then there's penetration testing vulnerabilities as well. Whether you're doing that through some sort of machining tooling, or whether you are performing that in a human resource who's looking for access points into your environment. But all of these vulnerabilities need to be looked at and tracked. And of course, those vulnerabilities exist on some sort of asset or infrastructure component in your environment. So having to start now saying, where do we start? Where do we prioritize? What do we action first? Can certainly be a daunting task if you don't understand the business context of that asset as well, right? Kirk, what are your thoughts on these areas here that are up on the screen?
So my first thought is actually the title of the slide, and I just want to put in square brackets, is expanding and contracting. To my previous point about the dynamic nature of the environment, it isn't about the fact that you don't know it is expanding and contracting. It's about getting those frequent updates so that you can trust the fact that it's about comparing your awareness with your expectations. And I think that's the challenge because the volume is only getting bigger. When we all left to go home for that 2-week period, and 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago, we all thought we'd be back and it wouldn't be a challenge. But there were a lot of organizations that had to figure out in a hurry to move not just their digital assets, but also their processes in order to manage those. So this is not just a technology problem and a technology solution. This is a people process technology challenge. And as far as the visibility into the remote employee network, I'd ask everybody on the line to ask themselves, do you have any one IT asset from any of your previous employers? And I'm going to guess that at least one of you is going to say yes, because they didn't track when you left that organization and they didn't request it back. That just proves that our appreciation for what the true value of lifecycle management could actually be to our environment. So if we aren't sure when it's leaving, then we probably aren't necessarily knowing when things are joining. Not that you may not have a network access control solution or a DLP solution, something that recognizes, but do we have the processes that plug into those alerts and awarenesses in order to update what we think is our total visibility? And it's not going to be perfect, but what we want to do is we want to get it as good as we can. We just want to be responsible and to be able to demonstrate due diligence. As far as misconfigured assets, so I mean, you talk about vulnerabilities, Klaudius. Vulnerabilities, yes, we look for things that are known signatures, etc. But if we think about it's got good version of a software, but it's this one bit that's been set, and I'll use a swear word, log4j. I mean, that was a test for all of us to understand. Okay, it's a configuration. The software itself was not flawed, but we need to be able to go out and understand that was. So everybody scrambled to understand that was. So if we take a leap forward, if we had total visibility of our environment, including what sort of application stack is sitting on our IT assets, perhaps we could have gotten a lot further down the field because everybody had that exercise and it went from days to weeks to maybe somebody are still exploring that challenge. But the whole idea is the next time we run into it, so when log5j, to make something up, comes out, what have we learned from that last event? What things would be the best time spent? And that's some of the discussion that we want to continue to have for the rest of the time. Dale?
Yeah, and I wanted to really add on to the point that you made. And in addition to looking at how your business processes are functioning, even at the strategic level, speaking about the governance and standards that you want to implement, because the rules of the game changed. And so organizations need to look at their asset standards and at the currency of their technology. They need to look at the governance, things like patching. So misconfigured software assets aren't the whole picture from an IT asset management perspective. There's also the issue of currency and how many legacy versions of Microsoft Office are you sustaining in your environment, because there are not proper standards and governance around the decommissioning of legacy versions, because those legacy versions of software that are, I would say, proliferate in many organizations are a really potent vulnerability that should be managed. And so we really go from people, process, technology, all the way up to strategic governance and standards. So I think that's probably a good point to launch. If
Absolutely, Dale. In fact, I was going to double click into that. Managing your software assets, your applications across your entire infrastructure is critically important when you get into those scenarios that are end of life, end of support, right? That means we're not getting those frequent software patches and updates to the end of life, end of support applications, because that's just, it's end of life, right? Those things are not perpetual. So what that means is if you're dealing with applications in your environment that meet that criteria, that means you've got stale software that is probably going through some sort of vulnerability exposure, and threat actors know this. They actually, I saw some statistics that say it's easier to go after those medium risk vulnerabilities on those legacy software applications because no one's really looking there, right? And there's no patches that are available either, right? So those kind of dormant scenarios sometimes pose those biggest threats.
Yeah, I want to talk about what we're talking about is assets. So Dale, you talked about introducing different categories of assets. We're focused on IT, but IT comes in different forms. One of the biggest risks right now is API risk. So the fact is, if you can't understand necessarily what systems are connecting what other systems and model those as something you can talk about, create some sort of an intangible object that you can then identify the risk and then what your mitigation strategies are. That's another important thing. So it isn't all just about maybe automated discovery. It's also those things you know about and that you can model. Just one note about the older things is I'm looking at a real-time dashboard, and number one vulnerability I'm looking at is a CVE with a 21 or 2010 date. And for those that watch this news, and I know everybody on this line is in the security game, but the hacker that took North Korea offline would not state which vulnerability they used to take it offline, but they stated that it was ancient. So regulators will typically give you a bit more leeway on the 0-day attacks because who saw those coming? But when you have something of vintage 2010, it's a little bit hard to explain why we didn't address that. And you're right, Klaudius, I think there's a misconception that if we go after the things that are risk rated higher, by the way, the NVD risk rating is not a risk score. It is a risk rating. And if we use this, and a lot of people do, that you may be looking at the wrong things first. So I really think it's important to bring in some of that enriched perspective of what your environment is. And sometimes that is not something you discover, but it's something you know.
Absolutely. So let's move on to this slide. I thought it was interesting to share some of these statistics. It actually was compiled from a few sources, ESG Research, Checkpoint Software, EdgeScan, and Ponemon. And we'll get into kind of what each of these mean. But when we talk about seeing the threats is not enough, what we're saying here is, oftentimes as an organization, we do a pretty good job of bringing in some sort of automation, a tool to discover our vulnerabilities, right? So what that means is we're able to find our, what I'm going to say, problem statement, right? So we got a vulnerability or an exposure here, but the challenge is finding that, how do we understand and where do we start on that solution statement, right? In other words, what actions do we now need to take to address this problem statement, which we have just found, right? So these stats are quite interesting that I want to share. On the left-hand side, where it starts off with the 61%. So a lot of organizations are saying it's really difficult to prioritize where to take the right actions on those threats and vulnerabilities that have the biggest impact to reducing that risk exposure in my environment. And then when you double click into that, you see another statistic that says that most organizations, 57%, don't always know which assets are business critical. That goes back to the idea of where are our assets? What sort of information does that house, right? What sort of information is processed on that asset? And how critical is that to my business? Those scenarios are likely the ones you want to bump up the risk score, bring more attention to, and action first, right? So without knowing which assets are critical, and also I'm going to say without having a centralized source of truth, getting out of kind of data silos of, security manages and tracks assets this way and IT does it this way, we need to centralize that view and give the right visibility so that we're working from the same source of information. Now in the middle here, some really interesting stats as well, which is that most organizations, right, almost 9 out of 10 organizations were saying, yeah, we have experienced threat actors attempting to exploit vulnerabilities on known vulnerabilities in our environment. The challenge is that those that actually were victims of a breach say that they were actually breached due to an unpatched and known vulnerability where a patch was available. So in other words, we know we have a vulnerability, we've discovered it, we know there's a patch, we just didn't get around to it quickly enough, right? And we were breached, right? So really interesting stats there. And then on the right-hand side, what I also found quite interesting is on average, it takes over 2 months to mitigate our most critical and high-risk vulnerabilities in our environment, right? Oftentimes, that's plenty of dwell time for a threat actor to do a lot of damage, and especially if it's a critical or high, that means we know there are most, riskiest threats in our environments, and we should be, tightening down that mean time to resolution as quickly as possible. But yet, the reality is it's taking us about 68 days on average based on that study. And then a lot of organizations are saying that is because we are at a disadvantage because we're trying to handle this process manually, right? We're using spreadsheets, we've got some data silos where we keep information here or here. So of course, naturally, it's going to take a long time to try to get the right information to the right people at the right time. It's not a technology problem, it's a people, process, and technology problem, as Kirk said. So Kirk, let me ask you, is there any stat on here that quite jumps out at you or that you're surprised to see?
Yeah, I could talk to each of them, but you did that. But I do want to focus in on the 87%. So it's about the existing vulnerability. But if we dig into the types of vulnerabilities, yes, there's a lot of organizations that are seeing those attempts. If you look at the different parameters around the CVE, the skill level, whether the exploit exists in the wild or not. So some of these need local, credentials, some are remote. So by looking at those three attributes within the vulnerability, that can really help you prioritize what it is. Because as you said, if the goal is to reduce the MTTR, you can't do it all at once. You've got finite resources. So fair enough. Then how do we get better? And if you understand the probability then within those numbers, now it gives us a strategy, one of N strategies to apply to what do we do first? What do we prioritize? I will quickly focus on the mission critical, the 57%, because I also believe that whether you have a system in place or not, everybody on this line has probably been called into a meeting or some sort of called onto the carpet to ask, okay, so what are we doing with our most critical service? Whether you're in e-commerce, whether it's a site that's serving the citizens of your country, it is something that if it failed, you would no longer cease to matter. And that is really what you need to focus on. So whether it's the list on the back of a napkin or whether you're doing formal risk management around which ones are, start somewhere. Because I would challenge you that your math is better until somebody comes along with better math. So always start, and you will evolve, but you have to start somewhere.
Gail, any final thoughts on this one?
Yes, actually, the discussion that Kirk was having around identifying and prioritizing your business critical systems is really relevant, and it's one of the foundations of an asset management program or a management system, in that we need to be in regular communication and we need to engage stakeholders like our lines of business, because just like your vulnerabilities, you can't possibly manage every single asset that you have in your environment. And so you need to know not only how vulnerable they are, but how business critical they are. And so that's certainly a way that a well-managed and structured IT asset management program can begin those discussions, and you can really leverage the business processes and the prioritization exercise, that your IT asset management team may have started and often have gotten to the end of, to be able to identify those and make that quick napkin list and marry those up. And so it also speaks to your point, Klaudius, about being able to communicate across teams and breaking down those silos. So, leverage, work together and break down those information silos.
That is spot on. In fact, this slide echoes exactly what you were just talking about, Dale. So why are we seeing kind of such lag and some, mean time to respond and remediate outside of the parameters and targets we have? And, why is it taking so long to, communicate and try to collaborate and get things done in our organization? And this kind of depicts a visual image of why that is. So collaboration's a bit messy, right? And the more complex and messier it is in our environment, that's the enemy of security. On the left-hand side here, you see the security team. On the right-hand side here, you see the IT team. At least that's how it's depicted. It may be, your vulnerability management team and your IT remediation team, or it could be any, business name here. But the general concept here is we've got a team, typically in the security domain, that's responsible for identifying those threats and exposures, right? Where's my problem statement? Where are these vulnerabilities, these exposures and threats in my environment? We need to validate, are they real? Are they false positives? Are these the same thing? Do we action these, or is this just noise? And then lastly, they're trying to prioritize to say, we believe these are the most critical. Let's kind of tackle them in this order. The challenge is we're dealing with a tremendous amount of alerts, right? Some organizations have thousands, hundreds of thousands, and some of our largest customers have millions of vulnerabilities across their entire infrastructure. So tremendous amount of alerts, really hard to map that to the right business context, right? Or there's a lack of business context. And we're trying to do this manually, right? And there's data and information available in different silos and domains that we're trying to glue together. On the right-hand side, the IT operations team typically says, okay, we ingest the data from the security team, and we need to organize ourselves in a way where we're organizing the right tasks to the right people. So we're dealing with workflow management, which could mean, are we patching? Are we deferring the patch? Is this a false positive? Is this an emergency patch, right? We could have different outcomes based on what it is we need to do. And we're trying to remediate that as quickly and efficiently as possible. But of course, the IT teams, their challenge is tremendous amount of asks with ridiculous expectations sometimes. And the data you just gave me is unreliable. I can't really trust this. It doesn't actually match to what we're seeing. So this center that says remediation gap in this red dotted line here says we're trying to communicate through things like email, spreadsheets, Teams chats, calls, emails. So we're working in our silos, and we're adding another element of a silo manual process to try to stitch things together to keep the wheels moving on the truck, right? Now, threat actors know this, right? They don't care about your business silos. In fact, they take advantage of that dwell time because they know they've got a bit of a head start and a dwell time that they know, no one's really going to be able to get ahead of this as quickly as we're seeing things, right? We're seeing this means, hey, we got our backlog of threats and vulnerabilities and alerts we're addressing. It's a real challenge trying to communicate across these silos. We're dealing with things manually. It's really hard to prioritize. There's a lack of transparency in the sense of who's doing what. Have we remediated that? How far in progressed are we in terms of that task or that effort? Are we hitting our targets? Are we missing our targets? And then lastly, if you're in a regulated domain, you may inadvertently be dealing with some regulatory exposures of missing some commitments there as well. Kirk, what are your thoughts on this one here? Or do you feel like things like hiring more resources would resolve this issue?
No, throwing more people at this problem, they just couldn't keep up with the volume and velocity because you'd have to continue to hire more and more people as this expanded. I think as much as you've drawn the remediation gap, going back to the title of this talk today, about accelerating detection and response or remediation, I think active governed response is perhaps the way to do it. And that's how we find economies of scale. And an example might be, if you wanted to, and you talked about the different responses, I'll call those, or the outcomes, I'll call those responses, because if you're going to defer something, okay, you want to defer it, but the scanners don't let you track the governance around deferrals. The spreadsheet may allow you to do that, but now you need to keep multiple versions of the spreadsheet because you have literally millions of responses coming out with each scan. So how do you govern that responsibly? So we need to apply this aggregation layer so you can apply this accountability and governance to it. On the remediation side, if we want to silence an alert, like we're aware of this vulnerability, we're aware that it attacks this area of environment, but everything we have in that technology stack is actually in an air-gapped environment, so we're not going to address that. If you want to have that exception track, so you've got a complete view of your risk and remediation debt, because that's really what we want to understand at any one point in time. As much as the visibility of the attack surface, we want to understand that what is the state of our response on that same surface. That active governance is critical, but we need to apply economies of scale. You cannot work at the granular level of a vulnerability. You cannot work necessarily even at the granular level of an IT asset. We need to start to group and take group actions against these things. And it all starts, I believe, with the life cycle of something coming online so that we understand what it is. And we haven't really talked about who's using it yet, because it may be a critical asset, but based on the who is using it and where the asset is today, the dynamic environment. So it isn't that it's coming on and off network, it's also where the asset is. We're starting to fly around the world again, but we did that before. So as that asset moves, its threat environment changes. So we need to have this dynamic, but an active governance.
Spot on. Dale, any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, two things. First and foremost, about adding human resources to be looking at this problem. I actually see that as an exercise in going past the law of diminishing returns, because what adding more people does, as you can see in this diagram, is it actually adds complexity to your communication networks. It opens up other possibilities for information to be missed or not transferred to the right people. And so where I always like to hone in on these sorts of discussions is the bottom right bullet under challenges, which is solving for unreliable data. And by putting efforts into solving that data reliability and accessibility issue, I think that's where organizations are going to be able to truly make strides forward in terms of their ability to govern and activate response in a more timely manner. If you can get that data into the hands of the right people at the right time, and you know it's correct, you can mitigate a lot of the impact and really shorten the dwell time. I almost compare it to the Colonial Pipeline breach versus the Accenture data breach, which happened at roughly the same time. And your ability to mitigate and respond to that was weeks to hours. And it was because Accenture had a really good, reliable data set that so they could only shut down what needed to be addressed because they could pinpoint where their issues were going to be.
All great points. And just to circle back on that, Dale, you said some interesting things earlier around more people adds also more complexity. And by that, I think about, okay, instead of having 3 people logged into this Excel spreadsheet, now we have 6 people logged into this Excel spreadsheet. But if we don't have things like a common view of assets and understanding criticality, maybe those 6 people are working on the wrong things, right? So if we don't have a common view of assets where things are slipping through the cracks because we're working on manual spreadsheets, emails, and working in data silos. And then when you think about the insight and oversight across the entire vulnerability management lifecycle, if you don't have an easy way to track which vulnerabilities are patched, where are we, trending on track with our targets versus missing, where are critical vulnerabilities, when you can't have that visibility from a reporting KPI metrics perspective, really what you're leading to is what I'm going to call a security patching paradox, right? Hiring more people without fixing those fundamental pieces means we're probably just tripping over each other a little, little more, right? That sort of thing. So,
Claudius, before you move on, I have
yeah.
one more point, and that's right. We haven't really said anything about prioritization. Yes, we can depend on the CVE attributes of something being found by a scanner. That's good. What is better is going to the CVSS 3.1 model where we think about temporal environmental scores, because now we bring in context. What is probably best in class today is enriching it with threat intelligence, because what was important yesterday at 4 o'clock could have changed overnight. With the geopolitical situation the way it is, President Biden on Monday said you will see an increase in cyber attacks. So for that was based on, the U.S. intelligence. They won't say what specifically, but businesses have been warned that, things are going to happen. So the prioritization using threat intelligence, I think, is critical, because I have many clients that are doing this. And I have some clients that luckily have 100,000 vulnerabilities that they're dealing with. I have clients that have 5 million. So it is really, really important, no matter what scale you're working on, that you try to apply the best of those methods that you can, because it will help you focus your limited resources. So that is the counterpoint to your, do we add more people?
Yeah, spot on, Kirk. In fact, just to add one more layer to that, right? Enriching it with that exploitability factor of risk is important, right? First of all, is it exploitable, right? And what's that exploit behavior, right? That also helps us understand, do we bump up that priority or can we bump it down, right? And again, on the asset criticality, the type of information that's there, that also matters. So there's a number of risk elements that we need to look at to really have that confidence that we're making the right business decisions at the right time. Right. So let's move on to this one. In fact, Dale, I'll ask you to kind of kick off this, because there's really both elements here. We've been talking about vulnerabilities. We've been talking about IT asset management as well. But let's jump into the IT piece, the assets.
Okay, thanks, Claudius. One of the points I made earlier was about IT asset management systems. So the word ITAMs in the title is not a typo. It's very intentional. So an IT asset management system is really that business framework, that governance, that strategic process set that you are using to guide all of the IT systems and supports that are going to be governing your IT asset management, your security and risk vulnerability management, your HR systems, your customer service systems. And one of the key links between solving for the vulnerability challenges that we're talking about today and an IT asset management system is what we have here on the left, which is a capability maturity model for IT asset management systems. And you'll see down at the bottom, it begins with trustworthy data. And so we've talked a lot about knowing what not only what your asset estate looks like, but what your vulnerabilities are, and having current, comprehensive, and consistent data around that to be able to provide. And that links very closely to the need for visibility in that vulnerability landscape. As an IT asset management system matures, you're able to start leveraging integrated systems and again, start feeding into that prioritization activity and be able to start focusing your efforts more deliberately. And then finally, Claudius, you've spoken a lot today about the need to automate your response. Again, it's speeding your ability to respond and mitigate damage, and that's really an optimization level. But I think if you take one thing away from this entire slide, it's the need to focus on establishing trustworthy data and getting eyes on the important vulnerabilities, asset classes, and really your attack surface, so that you can really start to manage it and build your maturity from there. And it goes back to a comment that Kirk made earlier on. You need to start. And it's not going to be perfect from day one, but starting there with trustworthy data is where I would begin.
Absolutely. So I'll add a couple of comments here. Automation, certainly a theme we've talked about today. And we mean automation in terms of discovering assets, discovering vulnerabilities and threats. But we also mean automation in a sense of collaboration. So automated and intelligent workflows to remediate these threats, right? When you think about a vulnerability management program, it's a team sport. It's not just one person or one team. It usually goes across multiple teams. So how do we get the right information to the right team at the right time with automated workflow management, automated notification, automated SLAs, and the information at the fingertips, knowing exactly how critical this is and the exact actions we need to take immediately, right? That automated prioritization is also something that's pretty important, in a way that we're looking at all the right elements, right? All the different risk factors, and that we are prioritizing the work that is best suited for our business, right? Not everybody's going to have the exact same way you prioritize risk. You need that ability to kind of configure and control in your environment how we prioritize risk. And then, of course, the visibility is multifaceted across not only your assets, not only your vulnerabilities, but who's doing what, right? That insight and oversight and the understanding of our program through those KPIs on how we're doing as a security and IT organization, that we can also articulate the data up to like the C-levels, the board of directors, right? Cybersecurity matters up the entire chain of command, if you will. It's a top of mind issue, and without the right data, it's really hard to have that conversation at the highest levels of the organization. Kirk, any final thoughts on this?
I want to share a favorite quote by Peter Drucker. There's nothing so useless as doing that which should never been done at all. And I think that speaks to level 2 and level 3 of this visual. And it drives me absolutely nuts when I hear about wanting to automate the system. And I get that that is an outcome that you want to get to. I think what we really want to say once you have level 1 is in level 2 and 3, what we're trying to find are good candidates. That is a responsible, pragmatic approach that will get you to the end goal. To take any other, way through this journey is, I'm going to say, irresponsible, because there are things that provide massive value that should be automated. But we first need to test whether it's effective. And then back to trustworthy. Trustworthy isn't just about the data. Trustworthy is about the outcome of applying a business rule, a business practice, a response treatment, because the holy grail of this is actually being allowed to say, I don't need a human to do this. I need a system to do this. By the way, I have more work for the humans to do. No, don't go away. Because it is about prioritization, not just of the program and the vulnerabilities, but also about what we do first. I won't layer any more. I think you've both covered it off very well.
Excellent. We are down to the final few minutes. Tracy, I'm going to ask you to kind of open it up to see if there's any questions that have come in. And we'd be happy to take those.
Yeah, so we have received a few that came in directly to me through the chat, specifically privately. So I would ask you all, if you have any questions for the group, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat box. It's easier for me to follow them in the Q&A box, but I did manage to write down the ones from the chat box. So we'll start with those. How can we maximize the value of an organization in terms of the IT asset lifecycle?
So that's a really big question. And I will go back, and it really sounds like a broken record response, perhaps. But bringing that value across the life cycle is really about those three questions that I brought up at the top of the webinar. If you focus on understanding what assets you have, where they are, and who's using them, and begin when the decision is made to bring an asset into the organization, and really make sure it follows all the way through deployment, operations, and especially deprecation, decommissioning, and the exit from the organization. I would say that that's probably the area of the life cycle that gets the least amount of attention, and it's going to provide some of the greatest benefits to your security and vulnerability response.
Great. Anyone else that we're good on that one? Okay. Second question, how can we enable productivity without compromising reliability?
I would imagine that is well, the question wasn't specific whether it's IT vulnerability or the entire thing, but maybe Kirk, I'm going to ask if you know, from your experiences, you've dealt with a lot of customers across all maturity scales, if you will. What are your thoughts around that one?
So productivity versus reliability. Well, I think we have to come down to prioritization. Sorry, Tracy, could you just reread the question again?
Sure. How can we enable productivity without compromising reliability?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. It is about prioritization, because if you have finite resources, we need to understand what do we work on first. The other thing is economies of scale. So if we have, say, a similar vulnerability that can be applied to multiple assets, that's an absolute, productivity gain. But we're not sacrificing reliability because we are confident in the response. The other thing is if we were to enrich some of this with threat intelligence, a lot of that threat intelligence comes with mitigating plans. So that increases our reliability because it increases our confidence in that response. So we're not asking specialists, God bless them, within our organization, but we're also looking at industry research to fortify our response. I think those two actions alone will give you a tremendous productivity boost without sacrificing reliability.
Okay, so question number 3, how do we choose IT asset management software? And maybe that's too big for the little time that we have left, but.
Dale, do you have any quick thoughts on that one? How do you choose IT asset management software?
Well, I do. And where I really think it's important, you have to understand that IT asset management is really a business problem masquerading as an IT issue. And so whatever solution you're looking for, you should make sure that it integrates with other systems, that you're able to expand and work seamlessly with other aspects of your business. So with your procurement team, with your operations team, with your customer support teams. And that for me is probably the biggest decision point.
Okay. I know we're at the top of the hour. Actually, we're just 1 minute past. We started at a few minutes after. So I'll just ask this one last question. We have started implementing a CMDB. What level of maturity do we need before starting to trust it for our vulnerability program?
Don't wait for a level of maturity that is high. Start. I just can't harp on that point more. Sorry if anybody else is going to answer, but I feel very passionately about the fact that if you wait for a certain level of maturity, you will never start. And I've seen some clients that are paralyzed and they just can't go. And through a lot of I'm going to say, painful conversation, we've, encouraged them to start, and they look back and they say that was the right decision. So I'd say if you even have a CNDB, absolutely go. If you don't have a CNDB, talk to somebody who can help you get one up, but you can run those programs in parallel.
That agile versus waterfall approach, right? We got to be agile in this nature, and we're building a car, we're driving the car. Things evolve and mature as we go through this process in general. Yeah.
Great. So we have no further questions in the question and answer box at this time. Oops, I lied. One just came in here. Let me. Okay. The association of security with privacy and ITC go together. So you talk about the cyber resiliency, but what about the privacy?
Kirk, do you want to take a first crack at that one, or?
Yeah, so privacy is about understanding what information would be, I'm going to say, classified as PII. So it is important that whatever, I'm going to say, process or solution you land on, it can, I'm going to say, enforce and respect those rules. Again, it's not about all information, it's about some information. So and again, privacy is about, having control over the use of information, whereas confidentiality is about the protection of information. That's more general in nature. So I see privacy as a subset of everything we're talking about, but absolutely it has to be part of the solution. So it's a set of rules, it's a set of logic, and it really does become down to, tracking, permission, consent, etc.
Perfect.
So that's great. So we are actually at 5 minutes after the hour now. So I think we'll need to close off in respect of everybody's time. But again, I want to remind you, if you have any questions about the U.S. Commercial Service, please contact me, Tracy Ford. And if you have any questions about the presentation, ServiceNow, or NewRocket, please contact Kirk Hogan, whose contact information is listed on the screen right now. I'd like to thank both ServiceNow and NewRocket for being our speakers today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. And if any follow-up can be done with the companies. Thank you very much. Have a good day.